Hello from Heirloom Books at 6239 North Clark Street in Chicago, Illinois. I'm Jeff Helgeson. During the 50 or so years following the American Civil War, literature of the southern United States, with the rather notable exception of Mark Twain, was generally dominated by romanticized depictions of antebellum culture and reactions to the lost cause of the Confederacy, like the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, as depicted in Thomas Dixon Jr.'s 1906 novel and 1915 silent movie adaptation, The Birth of a Nation. Although these themes also emerged in Margaret Mitchell's wildly popular 1936 novel, Gone with the Wind, and then its 1939 motion picture interpretation featuring Vivien Leigh and Clark Gable, a majority of Southern fiction following the First World War took a much different tone regarding the culture and social depictions of this region of the United States. During the 1920s, for example, a high school dropout from Oxford, Mississippi, who'd enlisted in the Canadian Air Force during the war and returned home falsely claiming to have seen action in France, having primarily produced poetry before then, began to publish short stories in local periodicals while living in New Orleans. According to Carvel Collins' introduction to William Faulkner's New Orleans sketches, it was these pieces which introduced many of the motifs within Faulkner's later work, clearly foreshadowing many of the characters which would reappear in subsequent novels, including such books as Satorus, The Sound and the Fury, The Hamlet as a Dying Light in August, and A Fable. At the same time he'd been submitting stories to New Orleans publications, Faulkner had begun work on his first novel, Soldier's Pay, originally called Mayday, about returning Great War veterans, like Ernest Hemingway's short story, Soldier's Home, and then a second book titled Mosquitoes, dealing largely with recognizable acquaintances from the Crescent City, including novelist Sherwood Anderson, who'd referred Faulkner to his publisher, just as he had done in Chicago for Ernest Hemingway. It was after this second novel, at Anderson's suggestion, that Faulkner's exploration of the South began in terms of the region, history, and population of his fictional 2,400 square mile Yakanaptwapa County, with the 1929 publication of Satorus, dedicated to Sherwood Anderson. This book, having derived many of its details from Faulkner's own family, including a great-grandfather, Confederate colonel, and entrepreneur who, after General Lee's surrender, built a railroad and made it run, wrote popular fiction and poetry, and whose statue to this very day looms over the graveyard in William Faulkner's hometown of Oxford, Mississippi. Renaming that city Jefferson, Faulkner populated it with members of families who would frequently appear in his other novels, such as Absalom, The Unvanquished, Go Down Moses, and Intruder in the Dust. Among them was Brian Snopes, an embezzling bank bookkeeper, and Peeping Tom, the members of whose family would eventually take over much of Jefferson and Yakanaptwapa County in a later trilogy begun in 1940, consisting of The Hamlet, The Town, and The Mansion, and demonstrating the decline of the aristocratic South and rise of a new dominant social economic class. Having gained literary acclaim with The Sound and the Fury, also published in 1929, that summer, while working nights in a power plant, Faulkner wrote As I Lay Dying. It's about the troubles encountered by a woman's family over a period of 6 weeks when trying to fulfill her final wish to be buried in her hometown of Jefferson rather than where she had lived with her shiftless husband and 5 children in Frenchman's Bend. Faulkner then achieved a popular success with Sanctuary, the story of a flirtatious debutante who is abducted and raped with a corn cob by an apparently impotent bootlegger called Popeye, and then installed in a Memphis brothel that was made into a pre-code movie in 1933 called The Story of Temple Drake. Year after the publication of Sanctuary, Faulkner reached back into the macabre tradition of Edgar Allan Poe with a story titled A Rose for Emily, beginning with the title character's death and progressing to the discovery of the decayed body of her former fiancé, who she had apparently poisoned and then slept beside each night for the following 20 or so years. In order to support what he once described as a wife, 2 stepchildren, a brother's widow, and her children, none of whom he claimed to have liked, Faulkner found it necessary to periodically serve as a Hollywood scriptwriter during the 1930s and 40s, as explained by Tom Doradus in a book titled Sometime in the Sun. Among a number of uncredited projects, Faulkner worked on a somewhat free-form adaptation of Ernest Hemingway's To Have and Have Not, featuring Humphrey Bogart and introducing Lauren Bacall, and then on the script for Raymond Chandler's The Big Sleep, a second Bogey and Bacall feature. By the time the United States entered World War II, however, Faulkner's first several novels had all gone out of print. Then, in 1946, editor Malcolm Crowley arranged for the publication of a portable Faulkner anthology, and by 1949, the author had received both a National Book Award and the Nobel Prize for Literature. Stating in his laureate address that when the last ding-dong of doom has clanged, human beings will still be talking, he also observed in the second section of The Sound and the Fury, I wasted a lot of time and trouble before I learned that the best way to take all people, black and white, is to take them for what they think they are and then leave them alone. Yet beginning the third section of that book with a character's assertion, once a bitch, always a bitch. William Faulkner, it would seem, provided a pretty wide scope for other writers from his region of the country. Among them, from Asheville, North Carolina, Thomas Wolfe was described by Faulkner as the greatest talent of their shared generation. Wolfe's initial autobiographical fiction, titled Look Homeward, Angel, released about 10 days before the stock market crash in October of 1929, was largely centered around his mother's boarding house, Old Kentucky Home, now a living theater-style tourist attraction, which her son called Dixieland. The book includes about 200 thinly disguised characters from Woolf's hometown near the lavish Vanderbilt estate Biltmore. Working with Maxwell Perkins as his editor at Scribner's Publishing, a second novel was reduced from a multi-volume epic like Marcel Proust's Remembrance of Things Past to a single volume, also set in Asheville, titled Of Time and the River, while additionally having learned the lesson that you can't go home anymore. Born in Alabama in 1891, but moving with her family to Eatonville, Florida when she was 3 years old, Zora Neale Hurston provided an African-American perspective on the South in more than 50 short stories, and several plays, an autobiography, and 3 novels. Most notably, in 1937, Their Eyes Were Watching God. It wasn't until 1975, however, 15 years after her death, that author Alice Walker brought renewed attention to Hurston's work with an article that appeared in Ms. magazine with a later film adaptation produced by Oprah Winfrey. Like Richard Wright from Roxy, Mississippi, with works like Uncle Tom's Children, Native Son, and then his autobiographical Black Boy, what Hurston provided was a look at issues of the South from an African-American point of view. Now, coming out of Texas, an apparent descendant of either frontiersman Daniel Boone or his brother Jonathan, and claiming a family connection to William the Conqueror, as outlined in Enrique Hank Lopez's Conversations with Catherine Ann Porter, following an abusive teenage marriage and divorce 9 years later. This refugee from Indian Creek relocated to Edgewater in Chicago, working as an extra in silent movies at the S&A Studios on Argyle Avenue, now the campus of St. Augustine College of Lewis University. But then she contracted what was diagnosed as tuberculosis, and during her recovery decided to become a writer, submitting newspaper articles and society gossip, before again being married and divorced, contracting gonorrhea from her husband, and then Spanish flu during the 1918 epidemic that killed more people globally than World War I had done, causing her hair to turn totally white at the age of 28. She relocated to New York and then Mexico, becoming the cosmopolitan acquaintance of such left-leaning individuals as artist Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo, taking on a number of lovers, and once stating, after several abortions and miscarriages, "I have lost children in all the ways that one can." In 1930, Catherine Ann Porter published her first short story collection, Flowering Judas and Other Stories, and she later recorded many of her experiences in a second collection of fiction titled Pale Horse, Pale Rider. At the age of 70, in 1960, Catherine Ann Porter published Ship of Fools, a novel she'd worked on for as many as 20 years, earning herself $1 million by the time it was produced as a major motion picture in 1965. Then she lived for another 15 years, lecturing at colleges and making several television interview appearances. Advocated for by Catherine Ann Porter following the publication of her story, The Death of a Traveling Salesman, in 1936. Eudora Welty from Jackson, Mississippi, had been a photographer for the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, during the Depression, as well as the author of short fiction, essays, and 6 novels. Even in her folkloric first novel from 1942, The Robber Bridegroom, Welty maintained a focus upon the Delta region and its inhabitants, both black and white. Her short story, A Worn Path, from a year earlier, in my mind at least, established an allegorical element within her writing through the careful selection of details, suggesting a mythological level of interpretation regarding the journey to town of an extremely old black woman named Phoenix Jackson to get medicine for her bird-like grandson, and the rejuvenation she feels after overcoming the ordeals of earth, wind, water, and fire before making a return trip home. In 1963, following the murder of civil rights activist Medgar Evans, Miss Welty wrote a first-person narrative from the point of view of the anti-integration murderer that appeared in The New Yorker, titled, "Where is the Voice Coming From?" once explaining, "Whoever the murderer is, I know him, not his identity, but his coming about. What such a man intent on such a deed had going on in his mind." Peering into the circumstance of a different assassination, United States first poet laureate, Robert Penn Warren from Daniel Boone's home state of Kentucky, described the political career and corrupt, adulterous, opportunistic life of Willie Stark in All the King's Men, based upon Louisiana's Huey Long, but also, it seems to me, Julius Caesar, and even perhaps any other chicken in every pot demagogue who just might someday happen to come along. Winning the Pulitzer Prize in 1947, the novel's film adaptation also won a Best Picture Academy Award, as well as Best Actor Oscar for Broderick Crawford in a role reprised by Sean Penn in 2006. And in 1940, a 22-year-old woman from Columbus, Georgia, piano student admitted to but not attending Juilliard, named Carson McCullers, who'd married a former soldier and aspirant writer, published a novel titled The Heart is a Lonely Hunter, describing the isolation of a group of misfits from a small southern town who confide their deepest feelings in a lip-reading deaf mute without realizing the loneliness of his existence until after his suicide, following the death of another deaf mute who had been his close friend. Although 4 years earlier, McCullers had published a story based on her efforts to become a classical pianist, it was this first novel which made her a national celebrity, her husband's literary ambitions declining into alcoholism and estrangement, and following a brief reconciliation, a proposed suicide pact, and he eventually taking his own life. Approached by and helping to foster the early career of Truman Capote, McCullers published Reflections in a Glass Eye, in a Golden Eye, Reflections in a Golden Eye in 1941, and The Member of the Wedding in 1946, which she adapted for the stage at the suggestion of playwright Tennessee Williams. Following year, however, McCullers suffered a stroke that left her completely paralyzed on her left side, yet she continued to write The Ballad of the Sad Café, which was adopted for the stage by Edward Albee in 1963 and made into a film featuring Vanessa Redgrave in 1991, 24 years after the author's death. A uniquely Catholic writer from among the Baptist fundamentalists of the American South, Flannery O'Connor frequently represented death as a form of divine grace. She once stated about characters in her 31 short stories, beginning with A Good Man is Hard to Find in 1953 and two novels, Wise Blood and The Violent Bear It Away, an identity is not to be found on the surface, but from the hidden and often most extreme. This allegorical vision, she said, was intended to make the concrete work double time and to demonstrate that we live in the mystery from which we draw our abstractions. Having distanced himself from Carson McCullers, Truman Capote, who'd been born in New Orleans, but after his parents' separation, left to be raised by relatives in Monroeville, Alabama, a friend and neighbor of To Kill a Mockingbird author Harper Lee, began his writing career in 1945 with the magazine publication of an apparent ghost story called Miriam. He, of course, went on to write Breakfast at Tiffany's, basis for a highly successful film adaptation starring Audrey Hepburn, and then spent several years researching and writing a groundbreaking true crime narrative based on the murder of a family in western Kansas titled In Cold Blood. Becoming a social celebrity in New York City in 1966, Capote hosted what has been described as the legendary black and white masked ball at the Plaza Hotel. But then, in 1975, Esquire magazine published a section of a long-awaited new manuscript titled Answered Prayers, which turned out to be a thinly disguised tell-all portraying Manhattan's cultural elite, and he became ostracized by the group of female socialites he'd called the Swans, frequently disco dancing alone at Studio 54, and then passing away of alcohol-related liver disease in the home of Tonight Show host Johnny Carson's ex-wife in 1984, something author Gore Vidal once sarcastically described as a good career move. Capote's childhood friend Harper Lee published To Kill a Mockingbird in 1960 about a young girl coming to understand the sometimes reclusive experience of others in her rural southern town, her father being a prominent lawyer who defends a black man falsely accused of rape. And she received a Pulitzer Prize, and she had her novel successfully transformed into a highly popular motion picture starring Gregory Peck, but then didn't release Go Set a Watchman, what her Associated Press obituary explains had been an early version of Mockingbird until the year before her own death, almost 6 decades after the first book, this one published in 2016. Like other writers from the southern United States, Harper Lee encapsulated the complex matrix of decayed social class, racial segregation, economic struggle, representing it not always in the politically correct manner that would offend no one and would allow genteel expectations to be fulfilled. Throughout the literature emerging from below the Mason-Dixon line since the First World War, there's a constant reckoning with the past and its ever-present influence on the lives of real people, especially in terms of social economic inequities extending from that region's original sin of human bondage and subsequent military defeat, as well as various efforts which have been made to either overcome, perpetuate, or willfully ignore them. I'm Jeff Helgeson. Heirloom Books is located at 6239 North Clark Street in Chicago, Illinois.